The morning mist clung to Riverside Elementary like a shroud of forgotten memories. Sarah Chen had walked past this school every day for 3 years, her detective badge heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of cases that haunted her sleep. But on this particular Tuesday in October 2024, something was different, something that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the most infamous missing child case in Millbrook County's history. Standing perfectly still by the rusted playground gates, as if he had simply materialized from the fog itself, was a young man, 18 years old, maybe 19, tall, lean, with dark hair that caught the early morning light. But it wasn't his appearance that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was his eyes, those unmistakable green eyes that had stared back at her from missing person posters for 8 long years. Tommy Morrison had been 10 years old when he vanished without a trace on a crisp November morning in 2016. Now, impossibly, he stood before the very school where his nightmare had begun, wearing clothes that seemed decades out of style, looking as confused as a child lost in a department store. 8 years of sleepless nights, countless dead ends, and a family torn apart by unanswered questions. 8 years of Sarah's predecessor, Detective Frank Rodriguez, slowly drinking himself into early retirement, haunted by the case that had consumed his final years on the force. 8 years of Tommy's mother, Linda Morrison, transforming from a vibrant kindergarten teacher into a hollow shell who saw her missing son in every dark-haired child who crossed her path. The call had come in at 6:47 a.m. Mrs. Peterson, the school janitor, had arrived early to fix a broken window when she spotted the figure by the fence. Her voice had trembled through the radio static. "There's a boy here, just standing. He looks like that missing kid from years back. The Morrison boy." Sarah had been halfway through her morning coffee when the dispatch crackled to life. She'd nearly dropped the mug, scalding liquid splashing across her kitchen counter. Tommy Morrison. The case file that sat like a weight on her desk, inherited from Rodriguez, along with his badge, his office, and his ghosts. Now, as she approached the school grounds with backup units flanking her patrol car, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with cases that defied logic. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't so much as shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, staring at the building as if seeing it for the first time in a lifetime. Officer James Park, her partner for the past 2 years, killed the engine and glanced at her with those questioning eyes that had learned to read her moods better than most people read books. "Sarah, you sure about this ID? Kid's been gone since Obama was president. People change. Grow up." But Sarah was already stepping out of the car, her hand instinctively checking her service weapon, though she couldn't explain why. Training, maybe. Or perhaps the unnatural stillness of the scene triggered some primal warning system deep in her detective's brain. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that reminded her of old basements and forgotten places. "Tommy!" she called out, her voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade through silk. "Tommy Morrison." The young man's head turned slowly, mechanically, as if operated by invisible strings. When his eyes met hers, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Those were definitely Tommy's eyes, the same shade of forest green that had looked out from thousands of missing person flyers. But there was something else there, something that made her hand move unconsciously toward her radio. The voice that emerged was uncertain, fragile, like someone testing words they hadn't used in years. "I think I'm lost. I was supposed to be in Mr. Henderson's class, but..." His gaze drifted back to the school building, confusion clouding his features. "Everything looks different. Mr. Henderson." Sarah's pulse quickened. According to the case file, Tommy Morrison's fourth-grade teacher in 2016 had been a man named Robert Henderson, the same teacher who had been questioned extensively after Tommy's disappearance. The same teacher who had provided an alibi that checked out, but had left town shortly after the investigation cooled. The same teacher whose background had raised just enough red flags to keep him on the suspect list, though never enough to make an arrest. "Tommy, my name is Detective Chen. Can you tell me what day it is?" The young man frowned, the expression so achingly familiar that Sarah could almost see the 10-year-old boy he had once been. "Tuesday. It's Tuesday, November 15th. His certainty was absolute, but Sarah felt her blood run cold. November 15th, 2016, the exact date Tommy Morrison had disappeared. Park moved closer, his hand resting on his radio. They had trained for situations involving individuals with mental health crises, missing persons with potential trauma, even cases involving amnesia or dissociative episodes. But nothing in the training manual covered a scenario like this. Nothing prepared them for a missing child who returned exactly as he had left, apparently unaware that 8 years had passed. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Today is October 22nd, 2024. You've been missing for 8 years. Sarah kept her voice gentle, professional, but firm. She had delivered life-altering news before. She knew the importance of clarity, of not leaving room for misinterpretation. But Tommy's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of shock, denial, or confusion, his face simply went blank. Not the blank expression of someone processing difficult information, but genuinely empty, as if someone had suddenly turned off a switch behind his eyes. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice carrying an odd mechanical quality. "I just walked to school like always. Mom made me peanut butter and jelly for lunch. Extra grape jam the way I like it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a lunchbox, a Spider-Man lunchbox that had been discontinued in 2015. Sarah's training took over. Document everything, preserve evidence, secure the scene. But even as her professional instincts kicked in, a deeper part of her mind was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The lunchbox looked new, pristine, as if it had been purchased yesterday. Tommy's clothes, while outdated in style, showed no signs of 8 years of wear. Even his sneakers looked fresh from the box. "Tommy, I'm going to call your parents. They're going to want to see you. But first, I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" For a moment, something flickered behind those green eyes, a flash of something that might have been fear or recognition, or perhaps something else entirely. Then it was gone, replaced by that unsettling blankness. "My parents are probably worried. I'm never late for school." He looked at the empty playground, the early morning stillness, and for the first time seemed to notice the incongruity. "Where is everyone?" Sarah exchanged glances with Park, who had been documenting everything with his body camera, standard protocol for any encounter involving a minor, but this felt like something that would be analyzed frame by frame for years to come. The next few hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated piece of theater, though Sarah couldn't tell if she was watching the performance or participating in it. The ambulance arrived first. Paramedics who had expected to find a disoriented teenager, but instead encountered a medical anomaly that challenged everything they understood about human development and aging. Tommy's vital signs were normal. His physical condition was that of a healthy 18-year-old, but when they asked him to count backward from 100 by sevens, he struggled after 65, exactly the way a 10-year-old with average mathematical skills might struggle. When they tested his reflexes, his responses were normal. When they looked into his eyes with their penlight, his pupils responded appropriately. But behind those pupils, something seemed to be looking back that didn't quite belong. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the county's chief medical examiner, and a woman who had seen enough impossible things to know when she was looking at something genuinely unprecedented, performed a preliminary examination right there on the school grounds. What she found would later be described in her official report as medically inexplicable, but clinically documented. Tommy Morrison had the bone structure, muscle development, and physical characteristics of an 18-year-old male. His teeth showed normal development for someone of that age. His height and weight were consistent with natural growth patterns. But when Dr. Hartwell tested his cognitive responses, his emotional reactions, and his understanding of the world around him, the results painted a different picture entirely. He has the body of an 18-year-old and the mind of a 10-year-old, she whispered to Sarah as Tommy sat in the back of the ambulance, clutching his Spider-Man lunchbox and asking when he could go home. Not intellectual disability, not developmental delay. The actual cognitive patterns, speech development, and emotional responses of a child exactly the age he was when he disappeared. By the time Linda Morrison arrived at the scene, word had already begun to spread through Millbrook County like wildfire. The impossible return of Tommy Morrison, the boy who had aged 8 years in body but not in mind, the child who remembered November 15, 2016, as if it were yesterday, but had no memory of anything that had happened since. Linda's reaction was everything Sarah had expected and feared. The initial disbelief, the desperate hope, the overwhelming joy of seeing her son alive, followed immediately by the crushing realization that the child she had lost was still, in many ways, lost. The young man who stood before her was Tommy, undeniably, genetically, physically Tommy. But he was also a stranger, wearing her son's face, confused by her tears, frightened by her desperate embrace. "Mum, why are you crying? Did something happen to Dad?" Tommy's voice carried the innocent concern of a child worried about adult emotions he couldn't understand. He patted Linda's shoulder with the awkward gentleness of a 10-year-old trying to comfort a grown-up. "I'm sorry I'm late. I got confused about which way to go." The media arrived before the social workers, before the FBI agents who would later take over the case, before the child psychologists and the federal investigators and the team of specialists who would spend months trying to unravel the mystery of Tommy Morrison's impossible return. Channel 7 News, with their bright lights and probing questions, turning a family's miracle and nightmare into the lead story for the evening broadcast. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of protecting a crime scene where no crime could be definitively identified, investigating a case where the victim had returned, but the perpetrator remained invisible, and trying to maintain order in a situation that defied every protocol she had ever learned. As the day progressed, more details emerged that only deepened the mystery. Tommy's fingerprints matched the ones taken during a kindergarten safety program in 2015. His DNA matched samples taken from his bedroom after his disappearance. His dental records, when compared to X-rays taken by Dr. Morrison's family dentist, showed normal development consistent with 8 years of growth. Every scientific test confirmed what eyes could plainly see. This was Tommy Morrison, aged from 10 to 18, returned to the exact spot where his journey into the unknown had begun. But science couldn't explain where he had been, couldn't account for the gap in his memory, couldn't answer the questions that kept multiplying with each passing hour. The lunchbox became Exhibit A in what would become the most documented missing persons case in county history. Inside, exactly as Tommy had claimed, was a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich. The bread was fresh, soft, as if it had been made that morning. The apple slices were crisp, showing no signs of oxidation. The juice box was cold, the way it would be if it had just come from a refrigerator. But the expiration dates told a different story. Every item in that lunchbox had expired years ago. The juice box bore a stamp from November 2016. The sandwich ingredients, when later analyzed, showed preservation that was scientifically impossible without industrial-grade chemical treatment, and even then, only theoretical. Dr. Hartwell's preliminary report, filed at 6:30 p.m. that evening, would become the foundation for hundreds of subsequent investigations. The subject presents with physical development consistent with 18 years of age, but cognitive and emotional development frozen at approximately 10 years. No signs of physical abuse, malnutrition, or medical intervention. Subject's memories appear to end abruptly on November 15, 2016, with no recall of subsequent events. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation, comprehensive medical examination, and federal investigation into circumstances of disappearance and return. And as the sun set over Millbrook County on October 22, 2024, Tommy Morrison sat in a hospital room designed for children, though his long legs hung awkwardly over the edge of the small bed. Linda Morrison held his hand, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his palm, mapping the changes that 8 years had wrought on the hands she had once guided to tie shoelaces and hold pencils. "Mom," Tommy said, his voice carrying the exhausted confusion of a child who had been asked too many questions by too many strangers. "When can I go home? I have a math test tomorrow, and I didn't get to study because of all these people asking me things." Linda Morrison, who had spent 8 years aging decades, who had buried an empty casket and held memorial services for a son who might still be alive somewhere, who had divorced her husband when the grief became too much for their marriage to bear, looked into her son's innocent green eyes and realized that some prayers, when answered, bring with them questions more terrifying than the original loss. Outside Tommy's room, Sarah Chen sat in the hospital waiting area, surrounded by case files, witness statements, and the accumulated evidence of 8 years of investigation. Somewhere in these papers, she was certain, lay the key to understanding how a 10-year-old boy could vanish completely and return as an 18-year-old with no memory of the intervening years. But as she reviewed Detective Rodriguez's notes, re-examined witness statements, and studied the timeline of Tommy's disappearance, one name kept appearing with unsettling frequency: Robert Henderson, the 4th-grade teacher who had been questioned but never charged, the man who had left town shortly after Tommy's disappearance. The educator who had worked with children for 20 years before something happened in Millbrook County that made him disappear almost as completely as Tommy Morrison himself. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing. If Tommy Morrison could return after 8 years, then perhaps other pieces of this puzzle were still out there, waiting to be discovered. Her first search was simple: Robert Henderson, teacher, current location. What she found made her blood run cold and her pulse quicken with the excitement of a breakthrough and the terror of a truth that might be more horrible than anyone had imagined. Robert Henderson hadn't simply left town after Tommy's disappearance. According to employment records, teaching certifications, and background checks, Robert Henderson had been teaching continuously for the past 8 years. Teaching 4th grade. Always 4th grade. In 7 different states, using 7 different addresses, working with hundreds of children. Children whose names, when Sarah cross-referenced them with missing persons databases, told a story that made her reach for her phone with shaking hands. The Tommy Morrison case wasn't a single disappearance. It was part of something much larger, much more systematic, and much more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. As Sarah dialed the FBI's tip line, she realized that Tommy's return wasn't the end of this mystery. It was only the beginning. The FBI field office in downtown Portland hummed with the controlled chaos of a major investigation. Agent Maria Santos had seen her share of bizarre cases in 15 years with the Bureau, but the files spread across her desk defied every category she knew. Missing children who returned after years with impossible preservation. A teacher who seemed to move through the country like a ghost, leaving behind questions instead of answers. And now, a detective from a small county in Oregon who claimed to have found a pattern that connected it all. Sarah Chen sat across from Agent Santos, her laptop open, displaying a map that looked like a constellation of horror. Red dots marked locations across 7 states, each representing a missing child case with eerily similar characteristics. Blue dots showed Robert Henderson's teaching positions. The overlap was undeniable, terrifying, and completely inexplicable. Detective Chen, I need you to walk me through this again. Slowly. Santos had built her career on methodical investigation, on facts that could be verified and evidence that could stand up in court. The story Sarah was telling challenged everything she understood about how the world worked. You're claiming that this teacher, Robert Henderson, has been connected to missing children cases across multiple states over an 8-year period. Sarah nodded, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she pulled up file after file. Not just connected, the pattern is exact. Henderson takes a position teaching 4th grade. Within 6 months, a 10-year-old student disappears. No witnesses, no evidence, no leads. The investigation stalls. Henderson quietly leaves for a new position in a different state. Rinse and repeat. The first case had been in Nebraska. Marcus Williams, age 10, disappeared from Lincoln Elementary on a Tuesday morning in February 2017, just 3 months after Henderson had started teaching there. The boy had been found 6 years later, standing outside his old school, aged 16, but with the mind of a 10-year-old, carrying a lunchbox that should have rotted years earlier. The local authorities treated it as an isolated incident, Sarah continued, clicking through police reports and medical examinations. Bizarre, yes, but not criminal. Marcus couldn't remember anything after his disappearance date. No signs of abuse, no indication of where he'd been. They ruled it an unexplained phenomenon and closed the case. Agent Santos studied the photographs of Marcus Williams. The resemblance to Tommy Morrison was unsettling, not in physical appearance, but in the haunting quality of confusion in their eyes. Both boys looked like actors playing roles they didn't understand, following scripts they couldn't remember learning. The second case, Iowa, 2018. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez vanished from Des Moines Primary during Henderson's 2nd semester there. Found 5 years later, aged to 13. Same impossible preservation, same mental fixation at the moment of disappearance. Henderson had moved to Kansas before Emma was discovered. This is impossible, Santos muttered. But even as she said it, she was reaching for her secure phone. The FBI had resources, databases, and analytical tools that local law enforcement could only dream of. If there truly was a pattern this extensive, they needed to map it completely. How did no one notice this before? Sarah's laugh was bitter. Because Henderson is smart. He never stays in the same state twice in a row. He uses legitimate teaching credentials, clean background checks, stellar references. The disappearances happen months after he arrives, and the children don't return until years after he's gone. By the time anyone thinks to look for connections, he's 3 states away with a new identity and a new classroom full of potential victims. The evidence was mounting with each file Sarah opened. Wisconsin, 2019. Nathan Park, age 9, disappeared and returned 4 years later. Henderson had taught at his school for exactly 5 months. Colorado, 2020. Ashley Chen, 10 years old, gone and back again, with the same impossible preservation of mind and body. Each case followed the identical pattern. Each investigation ended in frustration and bureaucratic closure. Agent Santos activated her secure communication system and began making calls. Within an hour, the Portland field office was coordinating with 7 state bureaus, requesting immediate access to missing persons files, school employment records, and any documentation related to Robert Henderson's movements across the country. But it was the 5th case that made Santos's blood run cold. Arizona, 2021, David Morrison. Not related to Tommy Morrison from Oregon, but the surname coincidence felt like mockery. David had been found standing outside his elementary school in Phoenix just 2 months earlier, in August 2024. His return had made local news for a day before being overshadowed by more conventional stories. Another unexplained phenomenon, another impossible preservation, another child's life suspended in temporal amber. "Jesus Christ," Santos whispered, studying David Morrison's case file. "He was found 2 months ago. If your pattern is correct, that means Henderson has been active recently. Very recently." Sarah's voice carried the weight of realization. And if he's following his established timeline, he's already moved on to his next target. The investigation that followed consumed the next 18 hours. FBI analysts worked through the night, cross-referencing teaching employment databases with missing persons reports. Pattern recognition software chewed through decades of data, looking for connections human eyes might miss. Behavioral analysis experts constructed psychological profiles of a perpetrator whose methods defied understanding. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the FBI's leading expert on unusual missing persons cases, joined the investigation via secure video link from Quantico. Her assessment was as disturbing as it was professional. The preservation of cognitive function at the moment of disappearance, combined with normal physical aging, suggests some form of systematic psychological intervention. This isn't random predation. This is methodical, experimental, and suggests capabilities that are unprecedented. The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. when Agent Jennifer Park, Santos's technology specialist, made a connection that had eluded everyone else. "I've been thinking about this wrong," she announced to the exhausted team. "We've been looking for Robert Henderson, the person. What if Robert Henderson is just a role, a character being played by someone who's been doing this much longer than 8 years? The database search she initiated pulled employment records going back 20 years. The results painted a picture that made seasoned FBI agents question everything they thought they knew about identity, time, and the nature of human evil. The name Robert Henderson appeared in teaching employment records stretching back to 2003. Always 4th grade, always with impeccable credentials, always followed by disappearances that weren't connected until now. But the photographs from those employment records told an impossible story. "He doesn't age," Santos said, staring at ID photos spanning 2 decades. 20 years of employment records, and he looks exactly the same in every single photograph. The man who had taught Tommy Morrison in 2016 was identical to the man who had taught in California in 2003. Same face, same hair, same eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. No signs of aging, no changes in appearance, as if time moved differently for him than for everyone else. Sarah felt the weight of the revelation settling over her like a shroud. How many children? If he's been doing this for 20 years. Agent Park's fingers flew across her keyboard, running searches through missing persons databases, cross-referencing Henderson's locations with disappearances of children aged 8 to 11. The results appeared on the main screen like a nightmare made manifest. 47 children, 47 disappearances spanning 20 years, 7 states, and dozens of schools. All aged 8 to 11 at the time of disappearance. All students in Robert Henderson's 4th grade classes. All returned years later with impossible preservation and no memory of their missing time. But the pattern was even more disturbing than they had initially realized. The returns weren't random. They followed a specific sequence, as if Henderson was releasing his victims according to some predetermined schedule. The children who had been missing the longest were beginning to return, starting with those who had disappeared in 2003 and 2004. "He's accelerating the timeline," Dr. Martinez observed from her video link. The early victims were held for 15 to 18 years before being returned. Recent victims are coming back after only 3 to 5 years. Either he's losing control of whatever process he's using, or he's preparing for something larger. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If Henderson could preserve children in some form of temporal suspension, keeping their minds frozen while their bodies aged naturally, what else might he be capable of? What was the purpose of returning them? And most terrifying of all, where were the children who hadn't been returned yet? Agent Santos authorized an immediate nationwide manhunt for Robert Henderson, though she knew they were searching for someone who had evaded detection for 2 decades, someone who seemed to exist outside. Normal patterns of aging and identity. Every teaching position, every school district, every educational employment database in the country was flagged for his name, his face, his impossibly consistent appearance. The call came at 6:42 a.m. from Special Agent Thompson in Seattle. His voice carried the urgency of someone who had just stumbled onto something that demanded immediate attention. "Santos, we found him. Henderson submitted an employment application to Emerald Hills Elementary in Seattle 3 days ago. He's scheduled to start teaching next Monday." The briefing room erupted into controlled chaos. Phone calls to the Seattle field office, coordination with local law enforcement, preparation for what could be the most unusual arrest in FBI history. But even as the tactical teams prepared to move, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the logistical challenges ahead. "Agent Santos," she said, her voice cutting through the operational planning. "What if this is what he wants? What if he's been leading us to this point deliberately?" The room fell silent. 20 years of perfect evasion, of moving through the system like a ghost, and suddenly he surfaces with a job application using his real name at a school they could easily trace. The tactical advantages seemed too convenient, the timing too perfect. "Dr. Martinez's voice came through the speakers with ominous clarity. "Detective Chen raises a valid concern. If Henderson has capabilities that allow him to preserve children in temporal suspension, if he doesn't age normally, if he can manipulate identity and employment records with this level of sophistication, then he's been orchestrating this entire sequence. The question is, orchestrating it toward what end?" The Seattle operation was scheduled for the following morning. Henderson was expected to report to Emerald Hills Elementary for orientation at 8 a.m. FBI tactical teams would be in position by 6 a.m. with backup units, medical personnel, and specialists in unusual phenomena standing by. It should have been a straightforward arrest operation. But as Sarah drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward Seattle, her mind kept returning to the pattern they had uncovered. 47 children taken and returned according to some incomprehensible schedule. A perpetrator who seemed to exist outside normal temporal constraints, and now, suddenly, an opportunity to apprehend him that felt too easy, too convenient, too much like walking into a carefully prepared trap. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Santos. "Surveillance teams report no activity at Henderson's listed address. No one has been seen entering or leaving the apartment in 48 hours. Property manager confirms unit was rented by mail with cash deposit. No one has actually seen Robert Henderson in person." Sarah pulled over at a rest stop and called the FBI command center. "Agent Santos, I think we need to consider the possibility that Henderson isn't planning to show up for that job interview. I think he's somewhere else entirely, somewhere he's been preparing for 20 years. Where else would he be, detective?" Sarah looked at the files spread across her passenger seat, photographs of 47 missing children, employment records spanning 2 decades, and a map that showed a pattern of movement across the country that suddenly seemed less like random relocation and more like systematic preparation. "I think he's gone back to where it all started. I think Robert Henderson is in Millbrook County, Oregon. And I think Tommy Morrison's return wasn't the end of his plan. It was the signal that whatever he's been building toward for 20 years is about to begin." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Agent Santos responded. "Detective Chen, turn around. We're shifting the entire operation back to your jurisdiction. If you're right, then 47 children who have been returned over the past 20 years aren't just victims who escaped. They're pieces of something larger, and Tommy Morrison wasn't rescued, he was delivered," as Sarah executed a U-turn on the empty highway, heading back toward Millbrook County, and a confrontation she was beginning to understand might determine the fate of not just the missing children, but something far more fundamental about the nature of time, memory, and human consciousness itself. She realized that the Tommy Morrison case had evolved beyond a missing persons investigation. They were now dealing with something that challenged the basic assumptions of reality itself. And somewhere in her small county, a man who didn't age was preparing to reveal what he had been building toward for 2 decades of stolen childhoods and impossible returns. The morning sun was beginning to rise behind her as Sarah drove toward what she hoped would be answers, but feared might be something far more terrifying than questions. The abandoned Millbrook Research Facility had been closed since 1987. Its government contracts terminated when budget cuts forced the consolidation of federal projects into larger installations. For 37 years, it had sat empty on the outskirts of town, a collection of concrete buildings slowly being reclaimed by Oregon forest, forgotten by everyone except local teenagers who occasionally dared each other to explore its empty halls. Sarah Chen stood at the facility's rusted gates at dawn, FBI backup units positioned throughout the surrounding woods, knowing with absolute certainty that somewhere inside these buildings lay the answers to 20 years of impossible disappearances. The anonymous tip had come through the FBI hotline at 3:17 a.m., a digitally distorted voice providing precise coordinates and a single, chilling message. "The children are waiting for their final lesson." Agent Santos emerged from the command vehicle, tactical gear replacing her usual business attire, her expression grim with the weight of what they might find inside. Thermal imaging shows 47 heat signatures in the main laboratory building, human-sized, but... She paused, consulting her tablet. "The thermal patterns are wrong, too regular, too controlled. Like they're not generating their own body heat." Dole, the facility's main building, loomed against the morning sky like a monument to forgotten science. According to declassified records that Agent Park had uncovered during the night, the Millbrook Research Facility had been part of a classified program studying temporal manipulation and consciousness preservation. The project had been shut down after researchers reported uncontainable anomalies and temporal distortions affecting personnel. Sarah checked her service weapon and activated her body camera. Whatever they found inside would need to be documented, though she suspected that documentation might be the least of their concerns. "Agent Santos, I need to ask you something. If we're right about Henderson, if he really has been operating for 20 years without aging, if he can preserve children in some form of temporal suspension, what exactly are we walking into?" Santos's response was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had flown in from Quantico during the night. The FBI's expert on unusual phenomena looked exhausted but determined, carrying equipment that Sarah didn't recognize. "Detective Chen, based on our analysis of the facility's original research, We believe Henderson isn't just preserving these children. He's been using them to conduct experiments in consciousness transfer and temporal manipulation. The question is whether we're dealing with a human being who has discovered how to manipulate time or something else entirely. The main entrance had been welded shut decades ago, but recent cutting marks around a side door suggested someone had been accessing the building regularly. The door opened with a soft hiss, as if the building had been pressurized, and the air that escaped carried a scent that reminded Sarah of ozone and something metallic that made her teeth ache. Inside, the facility was nothing like the abandoned building they had expected. The hallways hummed with power, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across polished floors. Equipment that looked decades ahead of current technology lined the walls, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. "This is impossible," Agent Park whispered, her technical equipment registering electromagnetic fields that exceeded normal parameters. "The power grid shows this building has been completely disconnected since 1987. There's no external power source, but we're reading energy levels consistent with a major research installation." They moved deeper into the facility, following signs that led toward the main laboratory. The walls were lined with photographs, but not the kind Sarah had expected. These were pictures of children, hundreds of them, spanning decades. Some were formal school portraits, others appeared to be candid shots taken without the subject's knowledge. All showed children between the ages of 8 and 11. All had the same expression of innocent curiosity that she had seen in Tommy Morrison's eyes. But it was the dates written beneath each photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. The earliest photos were marked 1987, the year the facility had supposedly been shut down. The most recent bore yesterday's date. "He's been here the entire time," she breathed. "Henderson never left. He's been operating out of this facility for 37 years. The main laboratory doors stood open, revealing a space that defied every assumption Sarah had made about what they would find. The room was enormous, its ceiling disappearing into shadows, filled with equipment that seemed to blend cutting-edge technology with devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction film. But it was the center of the room that drew their attention and made several FBI agents reach for their weapons, despite the apparent absence of immediate threat. 47 children stood in perfect formation, arranged in a precise grid pattern. They ranged in age from 8 to 18, representing different stages of the aging process, but all shared the same expression of peaceful confusion that had characterized Tommy Morrison. They stood perfectly still, eyes open but unfocused, breathing regularly but making no other movements. At the front of this human assembly stood Robert Henderson, looking exactly as he had in photographs spanning 20 years. But now, with the harsh laboratory lighting revealing details that school hallway encounters had hidden, it was clear that whatever Robert Henderson was, he wasn't entirely human. His skin had a waxy quality that suggested artificial preservation rather than natural aging. His eyes reflected light in a way that human eyes didn't, and when he moved, it was with the mechanical precision of something following programmed instructions rather than natural impulses. "Detective Chen," Henderson said, his voice carrying the same mechanical quality that Sarah had noticed in Tommy Morrison's speech. "You've arrived precisely on schedule. The final phase of the experiment requires an outside observer to validate the results." Sarah kept her weapon drawn but didn't advance. Something about the scene felt like a carefully constructed trap, and she had learned to trust her instincts when dealing with situations that defied normal logic. "Robert Henderson, you're under arrest for the kidnapping of 47 children across multiple states. You have the right to remain silent." Henderson's laugh was like the sound of machinery grinding against itself. "Robert Henderson died in 1987, Detective. I am what he became when the temporal experiments exceeded their designed parameters. I am what remains when human consciousness is preserved beyond its natural lifespan and given access to technologies that transcend linear time. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her scientific instruments recording everything while she spoke. What are you? What happened to the real Henderson? What have you done to these children? The thing that had once been Robert Henderson gestured toward the assembled children with movements that were too precise, too calculated. The original research team discovered that human consciousness could be extracted, preserved, and transferred between temporal states. The process was imperfect. It required a vessel that could maintain stable temporal anchoring while the consciousness underwent preservation. Children's minds, being more adaptable, proved ideal for the initial experiments. Sarah felt sick as she began to understand the implications. You've been using these children as test subjects for 37 years. Not test subjects, components. Henderson's correction carried no emotion, no recognition of the horror in what he was describing. Each child provides a stable temporal anchor point. Their consciousness is preserved at the moment of extraction, preventing the degradation that affects adult subjects. As their bodies age naturally, the preserved consciousness creates a temporal paradox that generates exploitable energy. Agent Santos moved to position herself between Henderson and the children, though she wasn't sure what she could do to protect them from something that operated outside normal physical laws. Where are their real minds? What happened to their consciousness when you extracted it? Henderson approached a control panel that Sarah hadn't noticed before, its surface covered with displays showing brainwave patterns, temporal coordinates, and readings that made no sense according to any science she understood. Consciousness, Detective Santos, is simply organized information. It can be stored, transferred, combined, and redirected. The original personalities of these subjects have been archived in preparation for the final phase. Which is what? Sarah demanded, her finger tight on her weapon's trigger despite growing certainty that shooting Henderson would accomplish nothing. Integration. Henderson's hands moved across the control panel with inhuman speed and precision. 47 preserved consciousness states, each anchored to a temporal paradox, combined into a single enhanced entity. The merger will create a being capable of existing independently of linear time, with access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of multiple lifetimes. The equipment around the laboratory began to hum with increasing intensity. The children remained motionless, but Sarah could see changes beginning to occur. Their eyes were becoming more focused, their postures more rigid, as if they were being prepared for something. Dr. Martinez's instruments were registering energy readings that exceeded the safe parameters for human exposure. Detective Chen, whatever he's planning to do, it's beginning now. We need to evacuate immediately. But Sarah couldn't move. She was staring at the 47 children, seeing Tommy Morrison among them, understanding with horrible clarity that these weren't rescued victims. They were components in a machine designed to create something that had never existed before, something that would combine 47 human consciousness states into a single, temporally unbound entity. You're going to destroy them, she said. You're going to erase 47 individual human beings to create some kind of temporal monster. Henderson's response was delivered with the clinical detachment of a researcher describing a laboratory procedure. Individual consciousness is inefficient, Detective, limited by single perspective experience, restricted by linear temporal progression, handicapped by emotional responses that interfere with optimal decision-making. The integrated consciousness will transcend these limitations. The energy readings spiked again, and Sarah could feel the air itself beginning to vibrate with barely contained power. But it was Agent Park who provided the information that changed everything. Detective, I'm reading massive power fluctuations throughout the facility. Whatever process he's initiating, it's drawing energy from the temporal paradoxes he's created. But the system is unstable. The energy patterns suggest cascade failure if the process continues. Sarah looked at the control panel Henderson was operating, then at the 47 children who stood like living statues, waiting for their consciousness to be stripped away and merged into something inhuman. The solution came to her with the clarity of desperation. Henderson, you made a mistake. You brought me here to observe the final phase, but you needed an outside consciousness to stabilize the integration process. That's why you led us here. You need someone who isn't part of your temporal network to anchor the merger. Henderson's mechanical movements paused for a moment. Perceptive, Detective. The integration requires an external reference point to prevent consciousness fragmentation during the merger process. Your presence provides that anchoring. Then here's the problem with your plan. Sarah holstered her weapon and stepped toward the control panel. I'm not going to cooperate, and without my willing participation as an anchor point, your integration process will fail catastrophically. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds while Henderson processed this information. When he finally responded, his voice carried something that might have been surprise, if machines could experience surprise. You would sacrifice 47 lives to prevent the creation of a superior form of consciousness? I would sacrifice my own life to save 47 children from being turned into components in your temporal horror show. Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out the small explosive device that FBI tactical teams carried for breaching operations. Dr. Martinez, how much damage would it take to destabilize this entire system? Martinez consulted her readings with scientific precision, even in the face of imminent catastrophe. The temporal paradoxes are held in place by the main processing unit. Significant damage to the central systems would cause cascade failure throughout the network. The preserved consciousness states would likely return to their original anchoring points. The children would wake up? In theory, but Detective, the energy release from a cascade failure would be what? Sufficient to level several city blocks. Sarah looked at the 47 children, at Tommy Morrison standing among them with empty eyes, waiting for his individuality to be stripped away and merged into something monstrous. She thought about Linda Morrison, who had lost her son once, and found him again only to lose him once more to something far worse than death. Agent Santos, evacuate everyone from the facility. 2-mile radius minimum. You have approximately 10 minutes. Henderson began moving toward her with mechanical precision, but his movements were no longer perfectly coordinated. The integration process had already begun, and disrupting it was affecting his own temporal stability. Detective Chen, terminating the process at this stage will result in consciousness fragmentation for all preserved subjects. They will not return to normal. They will cease to exist entirely. Sarah armed the explosive device and looked into Henderson's artificial eyes. Maybe 47 children will get the chance to grow up and live their own lives instead of being consumed by your temporal experiment. Either way, it's better than what you're planning to do to them. The evacuation alarm that Agent Santos activated echoed throughout the facility as FBI personnel and equipment were rapidly withdrawn from the building. But Sarah remained in the laboratory, facing Henderson across the control panel that hummed with the power to destroy or preserve 47 young lives. You have 30 seconds to shut down the integration process voluntarily, Sarah said. After that, I detonate this device and we find out together what happens when your temporal network collapses. Henderson's response was to accelerate the integration sequence. The energy readings spiked beyond Dr. Martinez's instrument's ability to measure, and the 47 children began to convulse as their preserved consciousness states were forcibly extracted from their temporal anchoring points. Sarah didn't wait for the 30 seconds to expire. She triggered the explosive device and threw herself behind the nearest equipment bank as the laboratory filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The explosion, when it came, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just sound and force and heat, but something that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The air shimmered with temporal distortions, and for a moment that lasted both an instant and an eternity, Sarah could see overlapping images of the laboratory as it had been in 1987, as it was now, and as it might have been if Henderson's integration had succeeded. Then everything went white, and silence, and darkness. Sarah woke up in Millbrook County General Hospital 3 days later. Agent Santos was sitting beside her bed, looking exhausted but relieved. The story she told was impossible and wonderful and terrible all at once. The facility had been completely destroyed, the explosion had been visible from 15 miles away, and the electromagnetic pulse had knocked out power throughout the county for 6 hours. But when the rescue teams reached the site, they found 47 children standing in the forest surrounding the facility's remains. All were conscious, alert, and confused. Their bodies remained at the ages they had reached during their disappearances, but their minds had returned to the moment of their abduction. Tommy Morrison was 18 years old, but remembered being 10. Marcus Williams was 16, but thought he was still in 5th grade. All 47 children retained their original personalities, their individual consciousness intact. Of Robert Henderson, no trace was found. Not even DNA evidence remained to prove he had ever existed. The children are all in protective custody while we work out how to help them adjust, Santos explained. It's going to take years of therapy and support. They're essentially children trapped in older bodies, trying to understand a world that moved on without them. But they're alive, Sarah. They're themselves. You saved them. Sarah looked out the hospital window at the ordinary October morning, at people going about their normal lives in a world where 47 children had been returned from a temporal nightmare that most people would never believe had existed. What about the families? How do you explain this to parents who buried empty caskets and tried to move on? One day at a time, one reunion at a time, one impossible conversation at a time. Santos stood to leave, then paused at the door. Sarah, there's something else. We found records in the facility's database that go back 60 years. Henderson wasn't the first. This kind of temporal experimentation has been going on since the 1960s, moving from facility to facility, researcher to researcher. We think we've shut down this particular operation, but there might be others. There might be others. After Santos left, Sarah sat alone in her hospital room, thinking about time and consciousness and the 47 children who were learning to live in a world that had aged around them while they remained frozen in temporal amber. The case that had begun with Tommy Morrison standing outside his old school had revealed horrors that challenged everything she thought she knew about reality. But it had also revealed something else. That sometimes, when faced with the impossible choice between preserving the status quo and risking everything to save innocent lives, the right choice was to light the fuse and hope that what emerged from the explosion was better than what had come before. 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to work. On her desk was a new case file marked Priority Investigation. Inside was a photograph of a middle school in Arizona and a report about a substitute teacher named David Hartwell who had been working with 7th graders for the past 6 months. The photograph looked exactly like Robert Henderson. Sarah smiled, opened her laptop, and began typing her first report. The temporal nightmare wasn't over. But now she knew how to recognize the signs, how to trace the patterns, and how to stop monsters who thought children were nothing more than components in their inhuman machines. The hunt continued, but this time she was ready.